The first thing fisherman Patrick Mully noticed that day on the banks of the River Shannon was two perfectly smooth river stones where Ilara O'Connell's eyes should have been. It happened on the morning of May 16, 2009, when Patrick was checking his nets. At first he thought the woman had simply fallen, but as he approached, he immediately realized before him lay a local resident whom everyone in Ballyclare knew. She owned the town's only bakery, and every morning her shop was the first to open its doors. Only not this time. The police called to the scene worked quickly and efficiently. Experts determined that Ilara had received several blows to the head with a heavy blunt object. No signs of robbery or other criminal acts were found. This immediately led investigators to believe that the reasons for what happened might be deeper and more complex. Town residents confirmed that Ilara walked the path by the river every day at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. Always the same route and always with her terrier, Barney, but now the dog was not with her. This fact immediately attracted the attention of the police, as the animal could be an important witness to the events of that evening. The coroner, after examining the scene, confirmed the main point. The stones were placed after Ilara had ceased to show signs of life, and someone did it deliberately and consciously. In Ballyclare, a small town where everyone had known each other for years, the incident caused shock and alarm. The police understood that they needed to act quickly and carefully before neighbors began to suspect each other. For now, the main task of the investigators was reduced to one thing: to understand where Barney the terrier was now. The only one who could have seen what really happened that evening on the River Shannon, Ilara O'Connell was known by absolutely everyone in Ballyclare. Moreover, they didn't just know who she was, they truly considered her an important part of town life. Every morning, she opened the doors of her small bakery on the main street at exactly 6 o'clock. Within a few minutes, the first customers would come in: night shift workers, owners of neighboring shops, school children, and their parents. She called each of them by name, remembered who liked croissants and who only bought rye bread. O'Connell's Bakes was not just a place where baked goods were sold. People gathered there to talk, discuss news, or just exchange a few words before the workday. Some residents later told investigators that Ilara always tried to help. She might give baked goods on credit, or even for free if someone forgot money. Many of those who came there every morning perceived this as personal care, not just the kindness of a shop owner. Employees who worked at the bakery confirmed that Ilara was a demanding but fair person. If one of her assistants made a mistake with a recipe or spoiled the dough, she calmly pointed out the error and showed them how to do it correctly. She never raised her voice. One employee would later tell the police that it simply wasn't customary to argue in the bakery. Any work disputes were resolved quickly and peacefully, so that customers wouldn't notice anything. Outside of her work, Ilara was also an example to her neighbors. People who lived near her said that she often swept the street in front of her house and the bakery herself. She didn't wait for communal services to arrive. She simply took a broom and tidied up because she believed the town should be clean. In Ballyclare, they were used to considering her a part of everyday life. And when the bakery didn't open that morning, local residents immediately felt that something bad had happened. People started calling each other, checking if she was ill or if there were any family circumstances. In the end, news of what had happened by the River Shannon quickly spread throughout the town. The police who began questioning residents faced a situation where no one had even the slightest idea who might have wished Ilara ill. Officers checked her personal data. There were no debts, no conflicts with neighbors, no complaints. No one could recall a single instance of her arguing with anyone in the shop or on the street. Dozens of statements from different people were recorded in the protocols, but they all agreed on one thing. The woman lived an absolutely peaceful life, and there was no reason why she might have been the target of such an attack. The investigation encountered its first and very serious problem: the lack of motive. Usually, when such tragedies occur, at least one person quickly emerges as the primary suspect. But not in this case. The town, where almost everyone knew each other by name, could not provide the police with a single clue as to who might have been interested in harming Ilara O'Connell. It was the absence of obvious motives that became the main obstacle for the investigation. And now, the police had to carefully study her daily habits to understand who and why might have crossed paths with her that evening on the path by the river. The morning of May 16 in Ballyclare did not start as usual. The bakery on the main street remained closed, although the lights should have been on in the windows for a long time. For local residents, this seemed unusual. Ilara O'Connell was never late. At 6 o'clock in the morning, regular customers were already standing at the door, but there was no one behind the counter. The curtains were drawn, the sign was not lit, and it was dark inside. Around 6:15, a bakery saleswoman, not having waited for the owner, stood at the door for several minutes and went home for her jacket, thinking that Ilara was just delayed. But after another half hour, it became clear that something was wrong. A woman who lived by a schedule could not simply oversleep or forget to open the shop. At 7 o'clock in the morning, a neighbor called Ilara's home number. The phone rang for a long time, but no one answered. She tried again a few minutes later, again silence. Then she went to O'Connell's house. The dog, which usually greeted every passerby with loud barking, made no sound this time. The door was closed, the windows were tightly curtained. By 7:30, alarming news had already spread throughout the town. The bakery was not open. Ilara was not responding. At the same time, fisherman Sean McGuire, who often fished on the River Shannon, went down to the old bridge. Townspeople often walked this path, and he had seen Ilara there more than once. When the man rounded the bend by the water, he noticed an unnaturally still figure on the grass. Sean came closer and immediately realized that something terrible was happening. He stepped back a few paces, pulled out his phone, and called 999. His voice on the recording was calm, but it was clear he was trying to restrain himself. "I found a woman. On the path, by the old bridge. It looks like Ilara O'Connell. She shows no signs of life." This call became the starting point of the entire case. A few minutes later, the first patrol arrived at the scene. The area by the river was cordoned off, and forensic experts from a neighboring district were brought in for the investigation. Ballyclare did not yet know that a story was beginning that would divide its residents for months, destroy familiar ties, and expose aspects of the small town that no one had spoken about aloud before. When the investigative team arrived at the scene, the police immediately began inspecting the area. Yellow tape was strung around the clearing, restricting access to unauthorized personnel. Forensics experts began moving from the center of the clearing to the outskirts, carefully examining every branch, every patch of soil and grass. In such a situation, even the smallest detail could prove important. Almost immediately, distinct shoe prints were discovered on the damp soil near the bank. Experts documented them with photographs and took measurements. It became clear that the prints belonged to at least two different people. One set of prints was approximately size 40, the other slightly larger. The prints were scattered haphazardly, sometimes overlapping, and it was evident that the people had moved quickly and carelessly. The weapon used to inflict the blows could not be found. Forensics experts thoroughly checked the entire area but found nothing that matched the description. Several stones lying nearby were checked immediately, but no traces or damage were found on them. The absence of this item greatly complicated further police work. One of the officers checking the area further along the path noticed a small object in the grass right by the bank. It turned out to be Ilara O'Connell's wallet. The forensic expert, wearing gloves, carefully picked it up, opened it, and checked its contents. Inside were 45 euros and several bank cards. This discovery ruled out the possibility that the attacker's goal was to rob the woman. Simultaneously with the inspection of the area, other police officers visited nearby houses, talking to local residents. In such small towns, people notice every little thing. And indeed, residents told the police that they saw Ilara walking along this path with her old terrier, Barney, every evening. All neighbors emphasized that the animal always stayed close and did not run far away. Police began searching for the dog in the nearby bushes and the wooded area along the river, but Barney was nowhere to be found. He did not respond to his name, no one saw him running through the streets, and no one found him nearby. The disappearance of the terrier was the first clue that immediately attracted the attention of investigators. Officers continued the search, already understanding that Barney might be the key witness to the events that occurred the previous evening by the old bridge. While forensic experts continued their work by the river, the investigative team focused on Ilara's immediate circle. The logic was simple: if not robbery, then personal animosity. Someone who knew her, who might have harbored anger or resentment. In the very first days, a name familiar to many Ballyclare residents appeared in the case files: Declan Ryan. Declan used to work for Ilara at the bakery. He worked there for almost 2 years, but 3 months before the tragedy, he was fired. The reason was a small theft from the cash register. Alara noticed the shortage and, without making a scene, suggested he leave amicably. Ryan, according to witnesses, took this badly. He was seen several times near the bakery after his dismissal, and once there was a heated argument between them right on the street. Neighbors heard him accusing Alara of ruining his life. The police immediately paid attention to this incident. Ryan fit the typical profile of a disgruntled former employee, a man around 40, unmarried, without a stable job, with a history of minor offenses. He lived alone on the outskirts of town in his deceased mother's old house. According to the report, he rarely appeared in crowded places, and neighbors described him as withdrawn and short-tempered. The same day detectives went to his home, the house looked neglected, and an old car without license plates stood in the yard. Declan did not open the door immediately, but upon seeing the police, he did not argue. He behaved calmly, although his facial expression showed that he had expected the visit. He answered questions confidently, denying any involvement in what happened. He said that on the evening everything happened, he was at his sister's house in a neighboring town, and even showed a gas station receipt from his journey there. Despite this, he was still taken to the station for a formal interrogation. Investigators wanted to check the details: departure time, exact location, contacts with whom he might have been in touch. Ryan did not object. He seemed to understand that suspicion in such a situation was inevitable. By this point, the first person who might have a motive appeared in the case. Declan Ryan became the main working hypothesis of the investigation. His conversations with neighbors, the history of his dismissal, his argument with Alara, and his general behavior after her death formed a clear, logical chain. Everything looked as if the police finally had a concrete lead. But during several hours of interrogation and checking his statements, a detail emerged that completely changed the direction of the investigation. Ryan had indeed left town on the evening of May 15. He was seen on the highway and then at his sister's house, where he stayed until morning. The gas station receipt confirmed the departure time, and a camera at the gas station recorded his vehicle. After checking all the facts, the police realized Declan could not have been at the crime scene. Suspicion was lifted from him, but this left investigators at a dead end. They again had neither motive nor suspect, and the only thing that could give them a new lead was Alara's missing dog, about which nothing had yet been learned. The alibi check for Declan Ryan began the same day he was brought to the station. He spoke calmly, not attempting to justify himself, but also not displaying much emotion. According to Ryan, on the evening of May 15, he left Ballyclare for Ennis, a town located approximately 40 kilometers away. His younger sister lived there, and that evening the family was gathering at her house to celebrate a birthday. Declan described the route in detail, including the departure time and a stop at a gas station where he bought coffee and cigarettes. The receipt he presented to the police was dated that same evening, approximately 1 hour before the presumed time Alara went for her walk. He also showed a receipt from a pub in Ennis where he paid for drinks after dinner. Everything seemed logical, but in such cases, the police check every word. An operational team went to Ennis and questioned everyone who could confirm his presence. 5 relatives, including his sister, gave the same account. Declan arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening and stayed with them until morning. The bartender from the pub remembered him immediately. The man was memorable for leaving a large tip and sitting at the counter for a long time, talking with locals. Camera recordings from the gas station confirmed that his car was indeed traveling on the highway towards Ennis. Investigators carefully cross-referenced the time frames. Even with the most optimistic calculations, Ryan physically could not have returned to Ballyclare that evening. His alibi proved solid, documented, and fully consistent with witness statements. After this, he was excluded from the list of suspects. Formally, the case against him was closed, and all collected materials were moved to the archival part of the investigation. For the police, this was a setback. The first version, which seemed logical, collapsed in one day. Work within the department began anew from scratch. Officers reviewed photographs, expert reports, and the results of the inspection of the path by the river. Something obvious was missing, a detail that should have tied everything together. At the same time, everyone understood that the murder could not have been accidental. Someone was waiting for Alara on her usual route and knew where she would be. Investigators returned to old photographs from the crime scene and to one detail that initially seemed insignificant: the missing terrier, Barney. After the trail with Declan went cold, the police once again turned their attention to the animal. Perhaps a new lead was hidden there, one that could lead them to those who were truly on the path by the River Shannon that evening. Within a few days of the incident, it became clear that the residents of Ballyclare no longer felt safe. If before, the town would quietly settle down in the evening, now the streets became deserted immediately after sunset. Neighbors, who had recently left their doors unlocked without a second thought, suddenly began checking their locks several times a night. The police quickly sensed how the atmosphere in the town had changed. Officers at the station recorded a sharp increase in calls from local residents. People began reporting even the slightest suspicious movement. Someone saw a stranger near the school. Someone noticed a car with unfamiliar license plates. Someone paid attention to a person standing on the street corner for too long. The number of such calls in the first week after the incident increased by 300%. Police understood that in most cases, these were false alarms, but they were forced to check every report. The owner of the local hardware store, who previously rarely sold locks, indicated in police reports that in just a few days after the tragedy, sales of door locks increased fivefold. People literally cleared them from the shelves, trying to secure their homes. Even those who had not previously used locking devices now specifically installed additional bolts. The life of the small town also changed dramatically in another way. If before, after dusk, groups of teenagers or children playing near houses could be seen on the streets, now the town seemed deserted. Parents did not let anyone under 16 years old out, even for a short walk in the yard. Many families specifically began escorting their loved ones to and from work, fearing a repeat of the tragedy. Fear and mistrust quickly engulfed Ballyclare. If before, local residents calmly communicated with each other, shared news, and discussed everyday events, now conversations became short and tense. People began to avoid discussing what had happened, but constantly tried to find out what others thought. Neighbors looked at each other suspiciously, although there were no real reasons for mutual accusations. For the police, this became a problem because real leads in the investigation still did not emerge. By this time, dozens of calls from townspeople and several false testimonies had already been checked, but the investigation had made no real progress. An atmosphere of collective tension began to form within the town, where every person could become a potential suspect in the eyes of others. The investigation had photographs, interrogation protocols, expert reports, and neighbor surveys, but not a single concrete indication of who was behind the crime. Ilara's dog was still missing, and this troubled investigators, who hoped that this lead would help them find the right path. On the morning of May 19, an unusual call was received by the Ballyclare police. The caller was Michael Doyle, a local farmer living approximately 5 kilometers outside the town. Michael reported that he had found a stray dog on his farm. The dog was exhausted, barely moving and lying almost motionless near an old shed. According to the farmer, the dog had a collar with the name Barney on it. The police immediately recognized this name. It was the name of Ilara O'Connell's terrier, who had disappeared on the evening of May 15. Investigators immediately went to the farm. When the police arrived at the scene, Barney was already being examined by a local veterinarian. The dog was emaciated, clearly having spent several days without food or water, but no serious injuries or other obvious signs of trauma were found. The animal was disoriented and frightened, but showed no aggression. However, during the examination, the veterinarian noticed strange stains on the terrier's fur. They were bright blue, barely visible to the naked eye, but clearly distinguishable upon detailed inspection. Hair samples were immediately sent to the forensics laboratory for analysis. While investigators awaited the results, the department began reviewing recent case materials again, checking whether Barney could have come into contact with such paint anywhere. One of the detectives recalled that, about 1 week before the incident, a report of a minor offense related to graffiti had been received by the department. On the old stone bridge, not far from where Ilara was later found, someone had drawn large letters and pictures with exactly the same blue paint. In the report, the police patrol at the time indicated that it was a case of teenage vandalism, and no significant efforts were made to investigate it. This case was deemed insignificant and put aside for later. However, this fact now took on a completely different meaning. When the laboratory analysis results came in, the coincidences were confirmed. The paint on Barney's fur and the paint used for the graffiti on the bridge were identical. It was an industrial aerosol paint of a bright blue color, not the most common in commercial sales. In Ballyclare, it could only be found in 1 or 2 stores. The police returned to the place where the drawings had previously been made. The graffiti covered almost the entire side of the bridge and looked sloppy. Several letters, indecipherable symbols, drawings, and traces of unsuccessful attempts to write something else. Investigators carefully examined the ground around the bridge, trying to understand how Barney could have come into contact with the paint, but no direct traces of the animal were found there. It had rained for 4 days, and almost all traces had been washed away. Then the police turned their attention to local teenagers. The graffiti case itself was minor, but in light of the new circumstances, it became an important link in the investigation. Investigators requested information from the school and the local youth club, trying to find out who might have been involved in the vandalism on the bridge. Teachers and club workers confirmed that they knew about such incidents and even suspected who might be responsible. The list of possible suspects turned out to be not so short, almost 20 names. But something did narrow the search. Residents living nearby recalled that the day before the incident, 2 boys were seen drawing on the bridge again, and Alara herself had approached them. A neighbor, who noticed this scene from her window, said that the conversation was short but tense. Alara was clearly displeased about something, and sharply told the teenagers something, after which they quickly left. For the police, this became a crucial lead. In a small town, teenage hooliganism was usually not taken seriously, dismissed as mischief and boredom. But now the situation had changed. Simple paint and the disappearance of a dog had turned a minor offense into a serious direction for the investigation. Investigators understood that they needed to find out as soon as possible who exactly was on the bridge, what Alara had talked to them about, and why everything happened precisely after this incident. When the results of the paint's laboratory examination came in, investigators immediately understood that they had a real and very specific lead. Specialists who examined the samples officially confirmed. The substance from Barney's fur and the graffiti on the bridge were completely identical in chemical composition. It was a special industrial-type aerosol paint, quite rare, which could not be bought in any hardware store. The police report specifically stated, such paint was sold in only one place, in neighboring Ennis. Investigators immediately went to Ennis to personally speak with the store owner. The man, upon seeing a photo of the paint can, immediately remembered the brand. He confirmed that the batch went on sale approximately 1 month before the incident and was small, only a few cans. The police obtained a list of all purchases made in the last 4 weeks and began to meticulously study each record. Detectives reviewed cash receipts, cross-referenced purchase dates with video recordings from surveillance cameras inside the store. In total, 7 people bought this paint during the specified period, and most of the buyers were builders or representatives of local firms. However, one of the purchases immediately caught the attention of the police. The camera footage showed 2 young men paying cash for several cans of precisely this blue aerosol. The salesperson noted that they did not look like professional workers, more like teenagers or students. Detectives returned to Ballyclare and began to check the identities of those who might match the video footage. They contacted teachers at the local school and soon found out that Liam Fitzgerald and Connor Murphy were in the video. Both teenagers lived in the town, studied together, and, according to teachers, had never been involved in serious misconduct. Nevertheless, their names had already appeared on lists compiled after questioning witnesses about the graffiti incident on the bridge. The police began cautiously gathering information about Liam and Connor's whereabouts on the evening of May 15. It turned out that neither of them was home that night. The teenagers' parents could not precisely confirm their location, as both stated that they had been in each other's company, out walking, and returned home late. This uncertainty further heightened the investigators' suspicions. Forensics experts, for their part, prepared a detailed report on the paint, noting not only the chemical composition match, but also the exact match of the color, sprayer type, and characteristics of the aerosol mixture itself. This confirmed that the paint on the dog and on the bridge originated from a single source, which was now known to the police. Investigators understood that they now had sufficient grounds to officially summon the teenagers for questioning and conduct searches of their homes. Until this moment, the investigation had consisted of fragmented assumptions and circumstantial details. But now there was a clear, tangible lead. A simple can of blue aerosol paint had turned a previously insignificant vandalism incident into the central piece of evidence in the case. For the police, this was an important turning point in the investigation. For the first time, there was an opportunity to move beyond assumptions and get closer to those who could have actually been near Ilara on the evening of the incident. Now, the main task was to find out why the teenagers bought this paint, what they were doing near the bridge the day before the tragedy, and why they were seen talking to Ilara in a tense manner. Liam Fitzgerald and Connor Murphy were far from the first people Ballyclare residents would have thought of in connection with this case. Both teenagers came from respected local families and were considered well-behaved and well-mannered young men. Their fathers were well known in the town. Liam's father, James Fitzgerald, owned a small construction business and had a good reputation among neighbors. Connor's father, Patrick Murphy, was the deputy manager of the local bank branch. In such a town, these were not just good positions. It meant respect and authority. At school, the teenagers performed quite well. None of the teachers could recall anything serious or provocative in their behavior. The school principal gave a statement to the police describing Liam and Connor as ordinary teenagers, not prone to aggression or conflict. On the contrary, many teachers spoke of them as polite and reserved boys who might have indulged in minor mischief, but nothing out of the ordinary. This is why, when Liam's and Connor's parents learned that their children had come under police scrutiny, the reaction was sharp and categorical. James Fitzgerald immediately contacted the local newspaper and stated that the police were simply trying to find someone, anyone, to calm the townspeople, and his son was a convenient target. Patrick Murphy sent an official letter to the precinct, calling the police's actions unwarranted and damaging to the family's reputation. The boys' parents openly accused law enforcement of starting a witch hunt. The tension in the town became even more palpable. The residents of Ballyclare were divided. Some supported the police, believing that every lead should be investigated, while others were entirely on the side of the teenagers' families. Liam's and Connor's relatives even organized a small support group that began to speak out against what they called police lawlessness. In a town where everyone knew each other, such accusations and protests only heightened the uneasy atmosphere. Despite growing public pressure and official protests from the parents, the police continued to methodically check the facts. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses, clarified the teenagers' routes on the day they bought the paint, and revisited the video footage from the store in Ennis. No other aerosol paint buyer came under suspicion. All of them had clear and verifiable reasons for their purchases. Ultimately, the investigation gathered enough material to seek official permission for searches of the Fitzgerald and Murphy homes. The judge, after reviewing the presented documents, decided to issue warrants for operational activities, despite the outrage of both families. The parents insisted that the police were simply trying to find someone to close the case quickly and maintain that investigators would find nothing. Nevertheless, the decision was made. Police prepared for the searches, understanding how important it was to conduct this procedure thoroughly and carefully. Everyone understood that the town was closely watching every step of the investigation, and any wrong move could lead to serious consequences. Ballyclare, a small town that had always lived peacefully and quietly, found itself on the brink of internal conflict. But for the police, the main priority remained not the opinions of the residents or the protests of the parents, but the search for any evidence that could finally shed light on what happened to Ilara O'Connell that evening by the river. When the police entered Liam Fitzgerald's home, the atmosphere immediately became tense. The parents stood silently beside the officers, watching as they searched each room. At first, nothing unusual was found: ordinary items, school notebooks, sports equipment. But in the garage, one of the investigators noticed a far shelf where, among old tools and boxes, a nearly empty can of aerosol paint was hidden. The bright blue color matched what was found on the bridge and Barney's fur. Simultaneously, a group of operatives conducted a search of Connor Murphy's home. There, in the teenager's room, a forensic expert meticulously examined shoes. After a few minutes, he picked up a pair of sneakers, carefully comparing the sole pattern with photographs of footprints from the scene. The match was obvious even at first glance. The officer carefully packaged the shoes and handed them over to colleagues for expert analysis. The parents of both teenagers were present during the searches and looked distraught. James Fitzgerald repeated that the can proved nothing, and Liam could have used it for any chore around the house. Patrick Murphy denied that Connor had even left the house that evening, insisting that his son would never have done anything like that. Both fathers tried to convince the police that a mistake had occurred and that their children were being unjustly accused of something they did not do. Meanwhile, investigators began questioning Liam's and Connor's classmates and acquaintances to get a clearer picture of what had happened in the days leading up to the tragedy. One of their school friends told the police that one day before the incident, on May 14, Liam and Connor were on the path near the old bridge. According to him, they were drawing something on the stone wall when Ilara appeared. An emotional altercation arose between her and the teenagers. Ilara was clearly unhappy, speaking loudly and clearly that she would tell her parents about everything. The teenagers quickly left, visibly nervous. Other witnesses living nearby confirmed this version. Ilara's neighbor gave testimony again, adding new details. According to her, the teenagers were irritated and even aggressive that evening. Connor loudly answered Ilara, claiming it was just fun and nothing serious had happened, while Liam looked scared and urged his friend to leave as quickly as possible. These testimonies became a crucial point. Investigators finally saw a possible motive: the teenagers' fear of their parents' reaction. In a small town like Ballyclare, family authority and parental reputation meant a great deal. Liam and Connor perfectly understood that if information about the graffiti reached their fathers, the punishment would be severe. And perhaps it was this fear that caused an ordinary argument to escalate into something much more serious. The police began to check this version in detail. Forensic experts immediately sent the found can and sneakers for additional examination to obtain irrefutable evidence. Operatives requested re-interviews of the teenagers, as well as additional conversations with their classmates and teachers, to understand if their reaction in recent days was somehow noticeable to those around them. For the residents of Ballyclare, this new turn in the investigation became a difficult ordeal. Two teenagers from perfectly respectable families, whom everyone considered ordinary school children, unexpectedly found themselves at the center of terrible suspicions. Locals again divided into those who believed the police had found the real culprits, and those who continued to insist that the boys simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, the investigation could no longer retreat. The facts were too obvious, and the only thing left for the police to find out was exactly how the fear of punishment led to the events of that terrible evening. When the police cars pulled up to the station, a small group of Ballyclare residents had already gathered near the building. Liam's and Connor's parents arrived with their sons, trying to maintain outward composure, but their faces showed that they were tense and anxious. The teenagers looked distraught. Liam lowered his head and did not look at the crowd. Connor, on the contrary, held himself defiantly confidently, as if everything happening did not concern him at all. Inside the station, both were immediately taken to separate rooms. The parents insisted on being present during the interrogations. The investigators were prepared for this and did not object. Liam Fitzgerald was questioned first. He sat across from the detective next to his father, hands on his knees, visibly nervous. When asked about the paint in the found can, Liam began to get confused in his testimony, first claiming he had never seen the can, then recalling that he might have bought it for some household chores. His father, James, tried to intervene several times, saying that Liam did not have to answer, but the detectives calmly reminded them that these were just questions and it was better to be honest. In the next room, Connor Murphy held himself much more firmly. His father, Patrick, sat next to him, seeming much more confident and reminding his son several times that he could choose not to answer if a question seemed inappropriate. Connor denied absolutely everything. When the detective asked him about the graffiti on the bridge, he merely shrugged and said he did not know what was being talked about. His confidence was so convincing that even his father sometimes nodded in support. However, the investigators were prepared. First, they showed both teenagers the receipt from the store in Ennis. It showed the date, time, and place of purchase of the paint. Connor immediately fell silent, trying to come up with a suitable answer. Liam just looked at the table and avoided meeting the detective's eyes. Then the police presented them with the testimony of a classmate who confirmed their conflict with Ilara on the bridge. Liam quietly murmured that he did not remember exactly what happened then, and Connor began to speak louder, claiming that the classmate had simply made a mistake or was lying. The next piece of evidence was the can of paint found in Liam's garage. At the sight of the item, James Fitzgerald sighed loudly and leaned forward, staring intently at his son. Liam began to clearly panic, repeatedly stammering that he had simply forgotten about this can and had not done anything wrong with it. His father told him to be quiet and said that they would not continue the conversation without a lawyer. With Connor, the situation unfolded differently. He still denied his involvement until the detective placed before him photographs of his own sneakers, comparing them with clear images of footprints from the crime scene. Connor froze for a second, his gaze fixed on the pictures, and it was visible how the teenager's face changed. Patrick Murphy also felt that the situation had become serious and began to insistently ask for the interrogation to be stopped. The investigator slowly repeated the question about how Connor's shoes could have left such prints at the crime scene. Connor turned away, stopped answering, and simply stared at the wall until his father loudly demanded to call a lawyer. In the report that later became part of the case file, it was recorded that after the presentation of the evidence in the form of shoe photographs, Connor Murphy fell silent and refused to continue the conversation without legal counsel. His silence was an important moment. For the investigation, it meant that they had finally hit the mark. If, until this point, the teenagers and their families could talk about coincidences or confusion, now for the first time, one of the suspects lost confidence and began to defend himself. The teenagers' parents insisted that the police were pressuring and trying to break their children. But for the detectives, the situation became clearer and more transparent than ever before. Connor's silence and Liam's panic clearly indicated that the police were closest to solving what happened that evening on the path by the old bridge. Now the investigators only needed to get a full picture from the teenagers of how exactly ordinary fear of punishment turned into a tragedy that shocked the entire town. After Connor fell silent, demanding a lawyer, investigators realized that the case was moving in the right direction. However, silence alone proved nothing. Irrefutable evidence was needed, that very detail that could not be denied or explained by chance. This was precisely the evidence that forensic experts were looking for when they sent Connor's sneakers for more thorough examination. After several days, the results were ready. Experts conducted a detailed chemical analysis of the soil remaining on the teenager's shoes. This was not just a formality. Soil can tell a lot, especially if its composition is unique and specific. And so it was. The soil on the sole of the shoes perfectly matched the samples taken from the spot where Alara was found. It was a special mixture of clay and sandy soil, characteristic only of a small area near the old bridge. Forensic experts emphasized in their conclusion that within a radius of 5 kilometers around Ballyclare, this type of soil was not found anywhere else. The laboratory's conclusion was immediately sent to the Murphy family's lawyer. When he saw the document, his facial expression clearly showed how serious his client's situation had become. He immediately went to his clients to discuss the hopeless situation. The lawyer's meeting with Connor's family lasted almost 1 hour, and during that time, the teenager barely uttered a word, silently listening, as the adults tried to make sense of a situation that had become irreversible. Meanwhile, the police prepared for the next stage. Investigators understood that they now had all the evidence to complete the investigation and press charges. But they wanted to hear from the suspects themselves how those events actually happened. The atmosphere in the town continued to remain tense. Residents knew that the police were close to a resolution and waited for news with anxiety and impatience. The next day, Connor's lawyer contacted the investigators and reported that his client had decided to give an official confession. For the police, this was a turning point. The silence, denials, and protests were over. Now the investigation had the opportunity to learn from a direct participant how a simple teenage conflict at the old bridge led to the tragic consequences that shook all of Ballyclare. When the lawyer informed the police that Connor was ready to confess, investigators immediately arranged an official interrogation. In a small office at the station, Connor Murphy, his lawyer, and 2 investigators sat at a table. The young man was very tense, tried to avoid the detective's gaze, looked away, and spoke so quietly that his words had to be repeated. Connor began by saying that he and Liam had no intention of doing anything serious that evening. All they wanted was to scare Alara so she would reconsider telling their parents about what happened on the bridge. According to him, they knew what time Alara usually passed the bridge, so they deliberately went out beforehand and waited for her in the bushes. He insisted that neither of them thought it could end in tragedy. When Alara appeared on the path, the dog was the first to notice her. Barney immediately started barking, sensing strangers. Alara stopped, looked around, and loudly asked who was there. Then Liam stepped forward and told her that she should not tell his father anything, otherwise he would never forgive him. Alara responded by saying that she would definitely tell her parents about everything, as they both should be held accountable for their actions. At this moment, according to Connor, an argument broke out between Liam and Alara, and voices grew louder. Alara tried to walk past, but Liam blocked her path and demanded that she remain silent. Then everything happened very quickly. The woman tried to push him away, but lost her balance, fell, and hit her head on a stone. Connor insisted that they did not push her intentionally and did not plan to cause her physical harm. Connor recounted that immediately after this moment, both became very frightened. He wanted to run away, but Liam said that Alara had already seen them and would now definitely tell everything when she woke up. Connor assured that it was at this moment that Liam picked up a heavy stone and did what, according to him, he could not have imagined before. He did not watch it. He stood with his back turned, only heard sounds, and when he turned back, Liam said that now they would definitely not be recognized. Connor confessed that after this, he was in a panic and barely understood what was happening. He stated that the idea with the stones also belonged to Liam, who decided to make it look like the actions of some stranger. He repeated that he himself did not touch anything or anyone after Alara's fall, only stood and waited for everything to end. After Connor's confession, investigators again called Liam for a re-interrogation. Liam, however, categorically denied the accusations, stating that Connor had made everything up to save himself, and that he had nothing to do with the events after the woman's fall. Thus, although Connor's confession shed light on the events of that evening, the situation became even more complicated. The teenagers began to accuse each other, and the investigation still had to establish the exact role of each of them. In the small town of Ballyclare, everyone already knew who was involved in this tragedy, but no one fully understood who exactly was the instigator and who bore the main responsibility. Based on Connor's confessions and the collected evidence, the investigation managed to reconstruct the events of that tragic evening step by step. A detailed picture of everything that happened on the path by the old bridge on May 15 emerged in the case files. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Alara, as always, left her house for a walk with her terrier, Barney. Her path followed her usual route, along the River Shannon, across the familiar old stone bridge. After about 15 minutes, she approached the bridge, where Liam and Connor were already waiting for her. The teenagers stood in the shadow of the trees so they wouldn't be immediately visible, and watched as Alara calmly approached. When she was right by the bridge, the boys stepped out to meet her. The conversation quickly escalated into raised voices. Alara had no intention of staying silent, and made it clear that she intended to tell their parents about the graffiti they had drawn on the bridge. At this moment, the altercation turned into an open conflict. According to the reconstruction, Alara tried to walk past, but Liam blocked her way. A small struggle began. The woman sharply pushed the teenager, but, losing her balance, she herself fell and hit her head on a large stone. At that moment, the teenagers were gripped by panic. They realized that the situation had gone beyond their initial plan to simply scare the woman. It was at this critical moment that Liam made a decision from which there was no turning back. According to Connor's testimony, he picked up a heavy stone and delivered several blows, trying to hide the tracks and ensure they could not be identified. Connor insisted that he did not watch at that moment and did not directly participate in this action, but he did not deny that he later joined Liam in what followed. Under the influence of fear and panic, the teenagers remembered a scene from a horror movie they had recently watched together. The decision to replicate what they saw was impulsive and senseless. Following Liam, Connor helped him complete this gruesome ritual with the eyes, believing it would throw the police off the right track. Then they disappeared into the forest, and the terrier Barney, frightened, ran away in the opposite direction. Now, thanks to the painstaking work of the investigation, the events of that evening were fully reconstructed down to the smallest details. Investigators knew who was at the crime scene, what actions each of the teenagers committed, and how exactly the fear of punishment led to the tragic outcome. Only one thing remained to be understood: who specifically bore the greatest responsibility, and what punishment would be fair for each. March of 2010 became an important stage in the case that had kept the entire town of Ballyclare in suspense for almost 1 year. The trial took place in the County Clare District Court. The hall was overcrowded. In addition to relatives, journalists, and concerned citizens, many residents of Ballyclare itself were present, wanting to hear the final decision. The trial proceeded with a jury, who carefully listened to all testimonies from witnesses, experts, and lawyers. The prosecution presented the results of numerous examinations, chemical analyses of paint and soil, forensic reports, and medical examiners' conclusions. The central piece of evidence was the recording of Connor Murphy's confession, which was played in its entirety to the jury. Connor confirmed his words in court again, but again insisted that the main role in the crime belonged to Liam. Liam Fitzgerald's defense stubbornly denied his direct involvement in the severe consequences of that night. The lawyer repeated to the jury that the entire accusation against Liam was based solely on the testimony of his friend, who, according to the defense, was trying to shift the blame to another to mitigate his own punishment. Liam looked dejected but firmly insisted on his version, not acknowledging his main role in what happened. The case was deliberated for several days, and the jury struggled to reach a unanimous decision for a long time. The townspeople in the courtroom silently watched as the fate of two teenagers was decided before their eyes. After lengthy discussions and careful examination of the evidence, the jury finally delivered a verdict. Both teenagers were found guilty of the murder of Alara O'Connell. After the verdict was delivered, the judge briefly addressed the jury and all those present, emphasizing the gravity of the consequences brought about by the teenagers' impulsiveness, panic, and fear of their parents. Despite the age of the accused, considering the severity of their actions and the public danger, the court decided not to hand down a lenient sentence. Both teenagers were sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence included a clause allowing them to apply for parole after serving at least 15 years in detention. Absolute silence fell in the courtroom after the sentence was announced. The teenagers' parents and Alara's relatives silently looked at each other, understanding that nothing could be changed now. The town of Ballyclare heard the verdict, but few felt relief. Yes, justice had prevailed, but the price was too high. The case was officially closed, yet questions that no one had fully answered remained hanging in the air. Now, all that remained was to wait and see how everyone involved in this terrible incident would live with it. After the trial, Ballyclare changed forever. Ilara's bakery never reopened. Its doors remained closed permanently. Liam's and Connor's families could not withstand the pressure from local residents and soon left town. Their homes were sold to strangers who knew nothing of the past. The bridge near which the incident occurred was renamed by locals in honor of Alara. It is now known to everyone as Alara's Bridge, and people avoid it, as if trying to forget that evening. The Stone Eyes of the River Shannon case became a symbol of how fear, panic, and a single mistake can destroy the life of an entire town. No one in Ballyclare could ever return to their former life. As the experts returned to the house on Providence Street, everything looked too perfect. The floors gleamed, the furniture was neatly arranged. Yet, it was this sterile cleanliness that made investigator Jean-Luc Moreau suspicious. An initial inspection revealed a pungent smell of chlorine, and that alone raised questions even then. This time, he decided to examine the room with a reagent. In the room, the lights were turned off. The forensic technicians began to spray luminol. At that very moment, the parquet and the lower parts of the walls lit up with a blue glow, first individual spots, then entire streaks. It seemed as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor. Characteristic splashes appeared at the doorway, and in the corners it was evident that the surface had been rubbed to remove traces. Photographers documented every area, specialists placed markers. All of this looked like a map, charting movements through the room. And the longer the processing took, the clearer it became. Something serious had happened in this house. The official expert report contained a clear statement. Extensive traces of human blood, washed away using a chlorine-containing substance. The version of a random disappearance was dismissed. Now the case was treated as a crime, and the first person the police had questions for was the owner of the apartment, Isabelle Dubois. The house where the forensic technicians had just found extensive traces did not outwardly differ from dozens of others in Marcinelle. A small brick facade, clean shutters, a well-kept courtyard. According to the records, a woman named Isabelle Dubois lived here. At the time of the events, she was 34 years old. She worked at a local insurance agency, had no criminal record, and always paid her utility bills on time. Neighbors knew her as a mother raising Leo, an 8-year-old boy. From the photos on social networks, a woman with soft features smiled. The captions were simple: family outings, park visits, some pictures from holidays. Everything looked as one likes to display. A calm, peaceful life. No one would have thought that this house would be under the lights of forensic technicians a few days later. The Marcinelle district itself also did not have a bad reputation. It is a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Charleroi. Families with stable incomes live here. There is a school, a pharmacy, a cafe on the corner. In summer, neighbors place plastic chairs in front of their houses, chat, and look out for each other. Everyone knows everyone. In this environment, Isabel seemed quite organic. She was described as a quiet woman who kept to herself, but never aroused suspicion. The investigation immediately received numerous witness testimonies from neighbors, and they all agreed on one point. The Dubois family gave the impression of a normal family. One of the neighbors said in his official statement, "We saw them every day. She seemed caring, and the boy was always neat and polite. We had no doubt that everything was fine with them." This contrast between the reality found by the forensic technicians and the image of the quiet family became the first serious point in the investigation. Outwardly, the house seemed a prime example of prosperity, but the expertise had already shown the opposite. Next, it had to be clarified how this rift between the visible image and the hidden truth had arisen and why Isabel came into the focus of the investigation. On October 17th, Isabelle Dubois called the Charleroi police. She reported that her son, Leo, had disappeared. According to her, he had gone to school the morning before and had not returned home afterward. For the duty officer, such reports were routine. On average, parents reported a disappearance several times a month. Usually, everything ended quite quickly. The person was found with relatives or friends. Sometimes it turned out that a teenager deliberately avoided returning home due to a family conflict. But here, the situation looked different. Isabel sounded confident. She repeated the same thing over and over. Her son had never been late without warning. He had always adhered to his established daily routine. There was no doubt in her voice. She spoke about what had happened as a disturbing and unusual event for him. The police recorded the data, created a description, and began the usual steps. They contacted the school. It was confirmed that Leo had indeed not appeared in class. They called the family's closest acquaintances, checking if he had gone to relatives. The answers were the same. No one had seen him since yesterday morning. This detail immediately brought the case into a more serious category. Towards evening, the story became public. A local television station filmed a short report in front of the Dubois house. In the picture, Isabel, with red eyes, visibly shaken. She sat directly in front of the camera and repeated a plea. "Bring Leo back to me." The report triggered an immediate reaction. Photos of the boy were spread on social networks. Neighbors formed voluntary search parties. In the Marcinelle district, dozens of people went out with flashlights, combing courtyards, parks, and industrial areas. The cars of the volunteers drove through the streets all night. The city rallied together. It seemed as if the disappearance of this boy had become a shared misfortune for the entire district. Printed flyers hung in pharmacies and shops. Wanted posters were distributed on public transport. Interviews were conducted in schools. Everything looked like an example of how a society can act as a united front. But at this moment, a gap began to grow between the official version and the real data. People believed the story of the disappearance. The police followed the protocol of a search operation. Isabel played the role of the mother whose child had disappeared, but the experts already knew. Her house harbored traces that in no way matched the version she told. This contradiction became the starting point. On the surface, search and compassion from the whole city. At its core, facts that pointed in a completely different direction. And here, a new phase began for the investigators, in which every action, every word of Isabelle Dubois had to be examined under the microscope. The first 24 hours after Isabelle's report, the police worked according to the usual scheme. All attention was focused on the search for Leo. They checked the school he attended, spoke with classmates and teachers. No one had seen him since the morning of the previous day. Criminal police officers reviewed camera footage at bus stops and interviewed bus drivers. there were no results. In parallel, search parties formed. In the evening, dozens of people moved into the Marcinelle district: police officers, volunteers, neighbors. With flashlights and dogs, they searched courtyards, underground garages, and the banks of the Sambre River. These places in Charleroi are always checked first when a disappearance is involved. During the night, patrols also drove into the industrial area, but the search did not yield a single clue. At this moment, investigator Jean-Luc Moreau decided to focus on the Dubois apartment. Formally, such an inspection is part of the usual protocol, but his experience told him that details might be hidden here that would escape attention. When the group of experts entered the house, it immediately stood out as looking too well maintained. There was not a single superfluous object in the hallway. An immaculately clean sink in the kitchen, the windows were clean. It resembled more an apartment viewing before a sale than an apartment that is constantly lived in. The greatest peculiarity was found in the living room. The floor gleamed as if it had been wiped several times in a row. The smell of chlorine was so sharp that one of the forensic technicians opened a window to ventilate. At the doorway, the shade of the parquet differed from the rest. The planks were lighter, as if this very spot had been cleaned particularly thoroughly. Moreau knew exactly. Such trifles should never be dismissed as coincidence. He recorded the observation in the report. A strong smell of a chlorine-containing substance was detected in the living room. The floor shows signs of recent wet cleaning. In the documents, it looked like a dry note, but for him, it was a signal. The picture was too unnatural for a house where a family had recently lived. Further inspection of the apartment yielded nothing new. No traces of a struggle, no objects that could indicate an event. Everything looked as if the residents had tried to create an appearance of perfect order. And in this contrast, between Leo's disappearance and the sterility of his home, the investigators first got the idea that more was hidden here than just a simple story of disappearance. Precisely this background became the basis for the next step. Moreau requested a detailed investigation using special reagents and ultraviolet lighting. A decision that at the time looked like a technical measure, in reality, paved the way for the most important evidence in this case. When the story of Leo's disappearance reached the media, the entire city saw Isabelle Dubois in only one image. She is a woman who has lost what is most precious, and now all she has left is to ask for help. The television cameras showed her tear-stained face. Journalists noted that she could barely stand. Her words were heard on the broadcast. "I beg you, bring him home." Against this background, neighbors called her the poor mother. Volunteers reported that she herself had participated in distributing flyers and searched with them. On social media, people began to comment that her pain was a shared tragedy of the district. But the police had a different approach to such cases. Every investigator knew the closest relatives are always in the first rows of scrutiny. This is not bias, but a rule that has been confirmed many times in practice. For this reason, despite Isabelle's public image, the attention of the criminal police gradually focused on her. The first interrogation revealed strange peculiarities in her behavior. She answered calmly, did not falter, and recounted the last few days almost without pauses. There were no slips of the tongue in her words. Everything seemed as if she had learned the sequence of events in advance. Moreau's report noted, "The statement is made smoothly and without delays. The formulations repeat like a memorized text." For an experienced investigator, this was an alarming signal. A person experiencing shock usually stutters and recalls details disjointedly. Here, everything went according to a script. Her version was as follows. In the morning, she took her son to school, returned home, and went about her usual tasks. Later, when he should have returned, he was not there. At first, she allegedly thought he was late with friends, but later decided to notify the police. At first glance, the story was consistent, but when they began to look for witnesses who could confirm her words, questions arose. Not a single neighbor had seen Leo on his way to school that day. The teacher said he had not appeared in class. Checking bus schedules and interviewing drivers also did not help. In the meantime, Isabelle continued to actively participate in the search. She went to the volunteers, spoke with the press, and chatted with people who offered help. In these scenes, she seemed convincing. But Jean-Luc Moreau paid more and more attention to small inconsistencies. When she spoke in front of the camera, her sentences were consistent. She repeated the same words. There was no impulsiveness in her behavior, which usually shows in a person in a state of despair. Even in moments when others tried to support her, she maintained the same tone, quiet but composed. At the department, they were not in a hurry to give her the official status of a suspect. This could have caused a stir and slowed down the search, but within the team, everyone understood. It was necessary to keep her under constant control. The decision was made silently. All new evidence and testimonies had to be checked and compared with Isabel's actions and words. Thus, she received the informal status of the first and most important object of observation. Publicly, she remained the mother pleading for help, but in the investigation files, her name was already under the heading Control. Now, every one of her movements and every word became part of the investigation. And here, a new direction of the case began to form. As the investigators began to check Isabel's words, the first thing that stood out was the temporal discrepancies. She claimed her son had gone to school on Sunday and had not returned afterward. But in the timetable of the school he attended, Sunday was a free day. The school was not open. This simple piece of information immediately destroyed her version. The police requested the attendance book. It clearly stated, Leo was last recorded in class on Friday, October 14th. There was no class on Saturday and Sunday. This means the mother's narrative that he went to school on Sunday is impossible. This inaccuracy did not look like a random error in her words, but like a deliberate attempt to shift the time of the disappearance. Next, the investigators turned to witnesses. Interviewing the neighbors revealed some children from neighboring houses remembered seeing Leo on Friday evening. He played with them in the courtyard and then quickly ran home when it got dark. After that, none of the neighbors saw him again. On Saturday, he was neither in the courtyard nor with friends. These statements matched the school book and confirmed that the starting point could not be Sunday, but had to be Friday. For the investigators, this was the first serious break between Isabel's official version and objective reality. Psychologists working with the police know exactly. Parents in a stressful situation can confuse days, forget details. But in this case, it was about a precise event, going to school. And if a mother insists on Sunday, even though she knows the school is not open on that day, then this is no longer forgetfulness, but a deliberate distortion. Moreau recorded all this in the report. A contradiction was found between the statements of Isabelle Dubois and the actual data. According to her, her son went to school on Sunday. The check confirms the school is not in operation on that day. The last confirmed presence by witnesses refers to Friday, October 14th. Within the department, this discrepancy was immediately labeled as the first lie. A lie in the chronology is always important, because time provides information about when and where to search. If a mother deliberately shifts the date of the disappearance, it means she is trying to cover up a period in which something critical happened. After that, the investigation ceased to be a formal search for a missing person. Every detail of Isabel's story was scrutinized. Everything was checked, with whom she had spoken, where she had been during those days, what calls she made. The discrepancy with the school timetable became the point after which the police could no longer trust her words without verification. Such a turn changed the dynamic of the case. Isabel ceased to be just the mother who lost her son in the eyes of the investigators. Now she became a source of contradictions, and every word of hers was recorded with special attention. The deeper the investigators delved into the details, the clearer it became that Isabel's behavior differed from how parents usually behave under similar circumstances. From the beginning, she willingly gave interviews to journalists, actively communicated with volunteers, and sought every opportunity to remain in the spotlight. Yet, behind the outward activity, the police saw something else, a cold composure where chaotic and contradictory emotions should have been. The first doubts intensified when it came to the lie detector test. The investigators offered her to take a test on the detector to confirm the sincerity of her words. Isabel refused. The explanation sounded simple. She claimed to be under severe stress, and the results could be falsified. Formally, she had the right to refuse, and the police could not force her to take the test. But in the case files, this detail remained as a note. Polygraph examination refused at the mother's initiative. For Moreau, this became another building block in the growing distrust. In parallel, the first witness statements arrived. One of the neighbors reported seeing Isabel's car on the night of Sunday to Monday. The car drove out of the courtyard around midnight. This was atypical for the Marcinelle district. The streets are empty at night, and such drives immediately stand out. When the investigators asked Isabel about her nocturnal drives, she said she had stayed at home. The discrepancy was too obvious. Further checks only strengthened the suspicions. In the protocol of telephone conversations, there were gaps without activity precisely during the hours when her car had reportedly driven away, according to witness testimony. For the investigators, this looked like an attempt to hide a part of her actions. Moreau put these facts together. On the one hand, the public image of a grieving mother willing to do anything for the search. On the other hand, the refusal of the lie detector test, inconsistencies in the narratives, and the witness statement about a nocturnal drive. All of this combined to form a picture where the outward role differed greatly from reality. Based on these discrepancies, Jean-Luc Moreau wrote a report requesting a new search. Now, it was no longer about a formal inspection of the apartment, but about a full-fledged forensic examination using chemical reagents and ultraviolet equipment. This decision was to enable the police to access the evidence that had previously remained hidden behind a layer of cleanliness and the smell of chlorine. On October 21st, the investigation team returned to the Dubois house. This time, Jean-Luc Moreau himself came along with the forensic technicians. Now, it was no longer a formal inspection, but a full-fledged expertise. The specialists brought portable ultraviolet lamps and a reagent that is used in the most complicated cases. From the outside, the house still looked immaculate. Clean windows, an even lawn, closed shutters. But inside, there was a tense silence. The living room was prepared for the treatment. The lights were turned off, the curtains drawn. Only the forensic technicians and some investigators remained in the room. First, a small area of the parquet at the doorway was sprayed with the solution. A few seconds passed, and the surface lit up. Then the entire room was treated. It then became clear. Practically every square meter of the floor and the lower part of the walls was covered with traces. The image resembled a chaotic canvas. Wide streaks ran across the floor, as if someone had tried to move something heavy. Irregular splashes appeared on the walls. In one corner, next to the armchair, an area stood out where the stains were particularly dense. Zones where traces had obviously been wiped away were also clearly visible there. Characteristic streaks showed that the cleaning had not been a one-time event, but had taken place repeatedly. The photographers documented everything. The cameras clicked incessantly. The pictures showed what looked like an immaculately clean surface in normal light. For the investigators, this was a turning point. Leo's disappearance was no longer a case about a missing person. Before them lay evidence that an event had taken place in the house that had been carefully tried to be hidden. The official report sounded restrained. In the course of treating the room with a reagent, extensive traces of biological fluids were discovered on the floor and walls of the living room. The traces were repeatedly treated with chlorine-containing agents. But behind the dry formulation lay the essence. The police had received direct confirmation that the mother's version did not correspond to the truth. Based on the expertise, the case was reclassified. Instead of searching for a missing boy, an investigation into a crime against life was now conducted. After that, Leo's disappearance was no longer a secret excursion or an accidental delay for the police. The focus of attention was the Dubois house itself, and the main source of answers was its owner. After this step, the investigation moved to a completely different level, from searching the streets of the city to the methodical reconstruction of what had happened behind the locked doors of this house. Luminol provided the police with a visual image, a bluish glow on the floor and walls that left no doubt that something had happened in the living room. However, for a criminal case, that was not enough. The glow alone cannot be presented as evidence in court. The chemical composition had to be confirmed, a genetic analysis performed, and it had to be checked whether there were other hidden traces. Exactly for this reason, all samples from the crime scene were sent to the laboratory of the Royal Gendarmerie. The work began with a classic biological analysis. Sufficient material for an examination was found on the surface of the parquet and walls. The first results showed it is human blood. Subsequently, the specialists carried out a DNA expertise. For comparison, Leo's biological profile, which had been taken in advance, blood samples from him had been kept in his medical file after a hospital stay at a young age, was used. The match was 100%. The laboratory report noted, identification carried out, genetic material belongs to Leo Dubois. This result was crucial. Until then, the investigators had only indirect evidence. The smell of chemicals, a floor that was too clean, the mother's strange behavior. Now there was a scientific basis confirming Leo's blood was indeed in the house, and attempts had been made to wash it away. But the experts went even further. They examined the drain in the bathroom. The method is simple. Even after repeated cleaning, microparticles of biological origin remain in siphons and on the inner surfaces of pipes. There, the forensic technicians found microscopic fragments of bone tissue. They were removed and sent for forensic analysis. The report was clear. Microparticles of human bone tissue were found in the bathroom siphon. Probable entry route: flushing during the cleaning of the room. In other words, actions related to the removal of traces took place in the bathroom. This could not be a coincidence. Taken together, these results completely changed the understanding of the case. Leo's disappearance could no longer be explained by an escape or an accident outside the house. The experts showed all decisive events took place in Isabel's apartment. That was the source of the blood. It was also cleaned there with chlorine-containing agents. And precisely there, the remains were flushed in the hope that the water would carry away the traces. After the report was submitted to the public prosecutor's office, an official expert opinion was drawn up. It became a turning point for the entire investigation. The death of Leo Dubois occurred in the house on Rue de la Providence. An attempt was made to remove traces and destroy evidence. From this moment on, the investigation had the right to reclassify the case. Now, it was no longer about the search for a missing boy, but about the investigation of a serious crime against life. This automatically expanded the powers of the police. Additional searches could be carried out, bank accounts checked, and the movements of suspects tracked. And at the center of all these procedures remained Isabelle Dubois, unchanged. Every one of her steps, every small detail from her biography and behavior, was now considered not in the context of a mother's grief, but at the level of direct suspicion. When the expertise confirmed that the tragedy had taken place in the house, the police gained the opportunity to request a full analysis of Isabel's phone connections. This is a standard procedure that often reveals more than the words of those involved themselves. In such cases, calls and messages become a mirror of actual relationships and actions. In the operator reports, one thing immediately stood out. In the days leading up to and after the alleged date of Leo's disappearance, the same number repeatedly appeared in the call log, and not by chance, but systematically. First, short calls in the evening, then conversations lasting hours. On the night of October 14 to 15, several calls in a row with minimal intervals. And already on the 16th, when Leo allegedly did not return from school, another series of contacts with this subscriber followed. To the investigators, this looked strange. In her interrogations, Isabel claimed that after her son's disappearance, she could hardly communicate with anyone, that she had no strength to call or talk about what had happened. But the call detail records showed the opposite. In the hours when she said she was completely alone, her mobile phone recorded intensive contacts with a specific person. The police identified the owner of the number. It was Antoine Legrand, 42 years old, married, living in a neighboring district. On paper, a respectable man working in a construction company. In his biography, there was nothing that could have aroused suspicion, but he was precisely the main recipient of Isabel's calls. The check confirmed even more. A secret relationship existed between them. They met, interacted outside the house, and hid their relationship from neighbors and acquaintances. Officially, they were just acquaintances, but the phone logs showed that the communication was regular and confidential. In the case files, the wording remained. The fact of personal and regular contacts between Isabelle Dubois and Antoine Legrand was established. The contacts continued even after the date of Leo's disappearance. This fact complicated the picture. Until this point, the police considered Isabel the only possible participant in the events. But now the "she acted alone" version was called into question. A new figure emerged, who possibly knew more than he said. Detective Moreau saw this as a serious turn. If Isabel was hiding an important part of her life from the investigators, the motives and circumstances of the case had to be viewed more broadly. The next step was the interrogation of Antoine Legrand and verifying his whereabouts in the days when Leo disappeared. The investigators understood. To fathom Isabel's motives, not only her current behavior, but also her past, had to be examined. At first glance, there were no compelling reasons for her to be at the center of such an investigation. She had no criminal record, led a quiet life, worked in an insurance company, and interacted with neighbors on an everyday level. Yet, the deeper the police delved into her biography, the clearer it became. This story had an inner layer that the surroundings did not see. The dossier contains records of interrogations of her relatives. It turned out that the Dubois family was always characterized by strictness. Isabel's parents were deeply religious people and placed excessive demands on their daughter. For them, reputation, external appearance, and how the family was perceived by neighbors mattered. When Isabel became pregnant out of wedlock in her youth, her parents practically disowned her. The relationship broke off, and for many years she lived separately, trying at all costs to prove that she could manage on her own. These facts helped explain her particular vulnerability. Her entire adulthood was under the pressure of the phrase, "What will people say?" For her, there was nothing worse than shame. This fear became the foundation of her character. Relatives described her as a reserved person, constantly afraid of judgment. Even in everyday trifles, she strived to be right. The external image was always more important to her than inner feelings. At work, colleagues noticed the same character trait. Isabel always tried to appear composed, emphasizing that everything was fine with her. Even when there were difficulties at home, she never showed weakness in public. In interrogations, acquaintances recalled, she tried too hard to be flawless. Everything about her had to look perfect. Psychologists involved in the investigation highlighted this trait as crucial. Their report stated, "For Dubois, maintaining an external image of well-being is a dominant behavioral model. In a critical situation, this model can lead to distorted perception and suppression of reality." This explained why her behavior seemed so smooth and rehearsed. She wasn't just giving a statement, she continued to play the role she had grown accustomed to since her youth. The role of a woman who has everything under control, even when control had actually been lost. These conclusions helped investigators view her not only as a figure with incriminating evidence, but also as a personality whose psychological characteristics could have directly influenced the development of events. And next, the police began to investigate not only her own past, but also the relationships she carefully kept hidden from her surroundings. By the time the expert opinions confirmed Leo's blood in the house and Isabel's connection to Antoine Legrand, the police already had enough to move on to active interrogations. But the crucial task was not to hear her previous explanations, but to make her contradict herself. The investigators understood. Both would hold out until the end, and the outcome of the case depended on who would break first. Isabel was brought into the interrogation room in the early morning. In the room were a table, 2 chairs, and a folder with photos taken after the living room had been treated with luminol. She was asked to recount Friday, October 14. She remained silent for several minutes. She only shook her head and said, "I have already explained everything." Then the investigator laid out the pictures one by one, the bright blue glow on the floor, the streaks at the doorway, the traces on the walls. He repeatedly asked the same question, "How is this to be explained?" But in response, there was silence. Her strategy was obvious, to maintain her defense until the end, to admit nothing. Meanwhile, in another room, Antoine Legrand was being interrogated. He denied everything. He said that his relationship with Isabel was limited to phone calls, that he had not been in her house and had nothing to do with the tragedy. But the investigators already had the phone billing data. They showed that his mobile phone was within range of the Dubois house on the evening of October 14. A printout with timestamps was placed on the table. Antoine first looked at it and waved it away. That's a system error. Then the investigator played a recording from surveillance cameras on the bridge over the Sambre. Night, a car similar to his. He denied it again. The interrogations ran synchronously. New evidence was presented to each of them. Isabel was shown receipts from a hardware store, a saw, bags, cleaning supplies. Antoine, a detailed list of calls made that night. Gradually, the tension grew. The investigators understood. The pressure had to be comprehensive. They built the picture in such a way that neither of them had an easy way out. After a few hours, Legrand was the first to give in. First, he said, "I just stopped by her place for a few minutes." Then, that he had seen Leo in the living room that evening. And finally, when shown the photos with luminol, he lowered his gaze and said, "Yes, I was there. I saw what happened. In the official protocol, it looked dry. Antoine Legrand changed his statement. He admitted his presence at the Dubois house on October the 14th at the time of Leo's death. But behind this formulation lay the essential. The secret lover who had denied everything just one day earlier now confirmed. He was at the scene when everything happened. This confession changed the course of the investigation. Now the police could no longer consider them as isolated figures, but as two participants in a story. The next step was inevitable, to verify what role each of them played that evening. After Legrand's confessions, the investigators obtained the right to a full search of Isabelle's car. The car was brought to a guarded parking lot, and for several hours every compartment was checked. They inspected the trunk, the seats, the floor mats, the glove compartment. Most of the items were in order: a first aid kit, documents, a few old shopping receipts. But in the glove compartment, they found what became the decisive piece of evidence in the entire case. It was a cash receipt from the Brico Planet hardware store. The date on it, October 15, 2011, meaning the day after Leo was last seen. At first glance, an ordinary piece of paper, of which there could be dozens in the car. But when the investigator unfolded it and read the shopping list, it became clear that this was no coincidence. The receipt listed 1 metal saw, 1 package of sturdy rubble bags, 10 pieces, 2 liters of bleach. In total, a little more than €50 for construction or household purposes, a more than specific set. But in the context of the case, it looked like a list of items directly related to the attempt to conceal traces. The purchase was documented. Experts immediately noted these goods could have been used in the order that was already emerging in the case. First, the tool, then the bags for packaging, then the chemical agents for cleaning the apartment. Everything matched the results of the house inspection, the expert data, and witness statements about the pungent chlorine smell. In the forensic report, this finding received the formulation: cash receipt confirming the acquisition of goods that could have been used in the elimination of traces. In a normal situation, this would have been an inconspicuous document, but it was precisely this that became proof of intentional actions. After that, the police had no doubts. The version of a random disappearance or a tragic accident had finally collapsed. Everything indicated that the owner of the apartment had taken steps to eliminate the consequences after Leo's death in the house. The receipt became the piece of evidence that connected all elements of the case: Isabelle's strange behavior, the nocturnal drives, the blood traces, the microparticles of bone tissue in the bathroom, and Antoine's confessions. And now, the investigators had a solid basis for filing an official charge. On that day, the investigators had everything to finally nail Isabelle. The most important materials were placed on the table in front of her. Photos from the living room, where luminol showed an extensive glow on the floor and walls. The expert protocol confirming the DNA match. The cash receipt from the hardware store, where she had bought a saw, bags, and chemical agents. And Antoine's interrogation protocol, in which he had already admitted to being in her house on the night of Leo's disappearance. The investigators understood. Now, she had no room to maneuver. Every version of a random disappearance or innocence collapsed under the weight of these documents. But they were not only interested in whether she would admit the facts, it was important to understand how she would react. For the police, the psychological reaction of a suspect often provides no less insight than the words themselves. At first, she did not react at all. The interrogation began with a direct question. Does she confirm that Leo was indeed at home on October 14? She did not answer. The investigator pushed the photos towards her. The glow of luminol on the entire parquet floor, the characteristic streaks at the doorway, traces of splashes on the walls. There was silence in the room. According to the protocol, the silence lasted about 20 minutes. It was not an immediate confusion, but an extended pause. The investigator asked one question after another, about the receipt, about the calls, about her nocturnal drives. But she did not say a word. No objections, no attempts at justification, no accusations against the police. She just stared at the table where the documents lay. Such behavior was baffling. Normally, suspects react at this stage. Some begin to cry, others accuse the investigators of pressure, still others desperately cling to their version. Here, there was none of that. Only silence. When she finally began to speak, it sounded unexpectedly calm. Her voice was even, without emphasis. She said Leo had fallen and hit his head. After that, she said, he stopped breathing. Then she added, Antoine told her that this was a problem, and she took care of eliminating this problem. She did not elaborate further. She did not say what she had done. She did not talk about what she had felt. She did not try to explain why she had not called an ambulance. Not a single emotional word, just a dry statement of the events. The investigators recorded her confession in the protocol, but the way she said it left no less an impression than the words themselves. For experienced detectives, the lack of emotion was the most unsettling. They noted the speech did not resemble a confession, but rather a report. No remorse, no justifications, no details that could have mitigated her role. For the investigation, this confession became crucial. It filled all the gaps. Previously, the evidence could be debated. Someone might have said the receipt from the store was a coincidence. The traces of cleaning were explained by her love of cleanliness. But now, her own words connected all the materials of the case. After this interrogation, the investigation line changed. The main task was no longer to prove the fact of the tragedy itself. Now, the entire chain of events afterward had to be reconstructed. What steps she had taken, where she was during those days, what she did at night, how she tried to erase the traces. The interrogation showed that Isabel had no intention of justifying herself or explaining what had happened. She distanced herself from emotions and described everything as a series of actions. For the investigators, this was a signal. Not only work with evidence lay ahead, but also with psychology. Because in her words, it did not sound like the narration of a tragedy, but the formulation of a problem that she had decided to eliminate. The confession opened the possibility of moving on to the next phase, the reconstruction of what happened in her house and outside it in the 2 days following Leo's death. The investigators collected everything that could be substantiated by documents and testimonies, transforming it not into lists and markers, but into a continuous timeline. The result was a dry roadmap of hours and actions. No dramaturgy, just a sequence of steps, checked against a checklist of evidence. Friday, October 14, second half of the day. The house on Rue de la Providence looks normal. Closed shutters, order in the kitchen, in the living room. The same parquet floor that will later glow under luminol. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, according to Isabel, Leo stumbles and falls. She claims that after the impact, he stopped breathing. In the apartment at this moment is Antoine. This is confirmed both by his own later words and by the phone records. Calls between them are registered during this period, then silence, characteristic of a situation where people are in close proximity. Nothing is scattered in the living room, and this too will be included in the reconstruction. There are no signs of a struggle, but later splashes and wide streaks will be visible at the doorway, precisely where Moreau had noticed the too clean area. Around 5:30 in the evening, Antoine leaves. He said this during the interrogation. In the phone data, movement is visible. His mobile phone leaves the cell range near the Dubois house. After that, a short series of conversations between them, at intervals of a few minutes. It is this nervous back and forth that often characterizes the hours after a shock. Calls break off, resume, fall silent again. He will later admit that he referred to what happened as a problem and demanded that Isabel take care of it. In the files, this will remain as a formulation without emotions, but for the chronology, something else is more important. After his departure, the secluded part of the house begins. The windows are draped. In the evening, there is a stronger smell of chlorine than usual. And the living room is meticulously cleaned, the night from Friday to Saturday. Isabel's phone is silent most of the time. No calls to emergency services, no requests for help from neighbors. For the investigators, this is not an empty space, but an important pause into which the first cleaning cycle falls. The parquet will later show wide areas of scrubbing, and the persistent chemical smell will be included as a separate entry in Moreau's report. Neighbors see no one. The light in the living room does not burn for long. Then, dimness. Saturday, October 15, morning. Isabel's car drives on the Route de Mons to Brico Planet. This is the only episode that connects her actions in the apartment with a specific purchase. The cashier scans the receipt. 1 metal saw, 10 bags for rubble, 2 2-liter containers of bleach. She pays in cash. No discount cards, no bank trace. The paper, later found in the glove compartment, will become for the prosecution that everyday item that transforms into direct evidence. In the reconstruction, this trip will take up only a few lines, but its significance is the most serious. All purchased items logically fit what is found and documented in the apartment. Saturday, day, and evening. The house is locked again. In the living room, almost sterile cleanliness. The photos under luminol will later show there are many traces and they are chaotically distributed, particularly dense in some places. At the doorstep, a bright spot of intense treatment. The chain of evidence leads us further into the bathroom. Microparticles of human bone tissue are found in the siphon. This is not conjecture and not assumption. A laboratory formulation without ambiguities. For the reconstruction, this is enough. During Saturday, work took place in the bathroom, after which both bleach and multiple rinses were required. No evaluations, only facts from the reports. Sunday, October 16, day. There is almost no external activity. No visits, no calls to emergency services. Towards evening, the picture changes. In the phone logs, short connections with Antoine appear, and towards night, vehicle movement is registered. This is no longer an assumption. Cameras on the bridges over the Sambre record the passage of a car that matches in make and color in the direction of the industrial area. The lighting there is dim, all around, abandoned warehouses and sparse streetlights along the quay. In the reconstruction, this sounds simple. The car leaves late in the evening, returns after a while, and then repeats the trip. Twice in one night. Of course, the camera does not see the contents of the interior, but that is not necessary for the conclusion about the route either. More important are the movements themselves, the time, and the repetition. Monday, October the 17th, early morning at home, silence, and at 9:15, a call to the police. Isabel reports that Leo did not return from school the day before. Sunday in this formulation sounds like a reliance on routine, but the check destroys the construction. There is no school on Sundays. Attendance was last recorded on Friday. For our roadmap, this means one thing. The time of disappearance was deliberately shifted back. The empty Sunday was inserted as a buffer between Friday and the call to the police. In Moreau's summary, this detail is noted dryly and without comments. However, it allows connecting the night drives with the subsequent public start of the search. After that, the chronology is already known to everyone, but here it gains density. On the evening of the 17th, the first reports appear on local television. Isabel asks citizens for help. Volunteers print flyers, neighbors go out with flashlights. At the same time, within the department, what the forensic technicians know is compared with what the residents see. Luminol in the laboratory transform the too clean living room into a map of routes over floors and walls, and the Sunday school into an obvious discrepancy. The reconstruction captures no emotions, but movement, Friday, fall and respiratory arrest, evening, Antoine's departure, Saturday, purchases and work in the bathroom, Sunday night, 2 trips to the industrial area on the Sambre, Monday morning, report to the police with a false date. To leave no blank spots, the investigators run through this line several times. They match the shopping time with the receipt and video surveillance at the checkout. Check fuel consumption based on electronic displays. Collect phone movements via the operator's map. In the house, thresholds and skirting boards are retreated. The glow leads to the doors and disappears in the corridor, as if someone had carefully erased the trace. In the bathroom, the siphon is removed. Microparticles confirm the version of the rinses. On the bridges over the Sambre, the timestamp is clarified. The trips fall in the deep night. This concordance is not an artistic trick, but a mathematical adjustment of time to the evidence. The entire reconstruction is kept in one tone. No conjectures beyond what has already been established. There are no descriptions of what she thought or felt. There are only steps supported by documents. And in this form, the picture is noticeably heavier than any emotional version, for it is not a narrative from the words of a participant, but a scheme in which every arrow is held by facts. The glow of luminol, the DNA match, particles in the siphon, a receipt with an exact date and a list of purchases, nocturnal routes according to cameras, the call at 9:15 with the false reference to Sunday school. This line leaves no room for coincidences. The sequence of actions is consistent and deliberate. First, the attempt to erase the traces in the living room. Then, the purchase of tools and packaging materials. After that, the work in the bathroom and multiple rinses. Finally, nocturnal drives towards the industrial areas and the morning start of the search, presented as a disappearance after school. This is what the framework of the case looks like when emotions are removed and it is assembled in strict order of hours and days. The official wording sounds short. The investigation reconstructed the sequence of events in the apartment on Rue de la Providence and the subsequent actions of concealment. But for the viewer, something else is more important. One sees where the everyday version ends and that series of steps begins that cannot be explained otherwise. After that, it only remains to legally establish this chronology and assign roles. Who pushed, whom to what, who made decisions, and how they implemented them. This will be the focus of the next phase of the investigation. Once the investigation documents were collected, the case moved to the legal level. Everything that for the investigators formed a chain of events now transformed into pages of a criminal file, articles of the code, and concrete charges. The trial began in May 2013. In the courtroom, there was a completely different atmosphere than in the interrogation room or at the crime scene. Here, the smell of chlorine and the luminol maps were not discussed. Here, the language of dry formulations was spoken, negligent homicide, disturbance of the peace of the dead, obstruction of justice. Every detail of the investigation became a paragraph of the indictment. The prosecution relied on the entire body of evidence: photos, expert opinions, found cash receipts, Antoine's confessions, and Isabelle's own words. In his speech, the prosecutor emphasized that the actions after the tragedy were deliberate. The purchase of tools, the elimination of traces, the nocturnal drives to the industrial area. All of this excluded the version of an accident. The defense insisted on something different. Isabelle's lawyers referred to the psychiatric reports that diagnosed her with a dissociative disorder. In their opinion, she did not act with full awareness, but in a state of psychological breakdown, triggered by panic and Legrand's pressure. This did not negate the facts, but, according to the defense, should mitigate the punishment. Antoine, on the other hand, tried to minimize his role. He claimed not to have been directly involved in what happened after Leo's death, but only to have been afraid for his family and reputation. But the phone records and his own changed statements showed the opposite. He knew what had happened and consciously walked away, leaving everything to Isabelle. The court heard experts, witnesses, and relatives. It heard the arguments of the defense and the prosecution, but the outcome already sounded in legal formulations. Isabelle Dubois is found guilty of negligent homicide, acts of concealment, and obstruction of justice. The sentence, 20 years of imprisonment. Antoine Legrand received a milder sentence, 5 years of imprisonment for failure to render assistance to a person in danger and for involvement in the disposal of evidence. These numbers marked the conclusion of the court proceedings, but the story did not end with the pronouncement of the verdict. The question of where Isabelle's guilt ended and Antoine's influence began remained open and was discussed by society long after the case was closed. The story of Isabelle Dubois formally ended in the courtroom. The verdict was pronounced, the sentences determined, the legal part of the case concluded. But in such stories, the legal conclusion never coincides with the human one. There remain consequences that cannot be translated into pages of protocols. The house on Rue de la Providence remained sealed for a long time after its owner's arrest. Neighbors recounted that for several more months, people from the prosecutor's office came there, collected the remaining belongings, and conducted renewed inspections. Then the house was put up for sale, but no one dared to buy it. Legally, the property changed hands, but in fact, the building remains empty to this day. For the residents of the neighborhood, it became a reminder of the tragedy, of what happened behind the closed curtains. People tried to avoid it, and children even stopped playing on that street. The story also found a continuation on the internet. In social networks, in groups where photos of Leo were once published with requests for help in searching, hundreds of comments remained. Only the tone completely changed. Instead of support, there were curses and accusations against Isabelle. The same neighbors who brought her food in the first days now wrote that they had always felt something eerie. The trust that initially made her a symbol of a shared misfortune turned into its opposite, public contempt. For the investigators, the case was considered solved, but in a material sense, it remained unfinished. Following Isabel's and Antoine's confessions, the police conducted searches in the industrial area and at the landfill. Equipment was used, containers were checked, dozens of tons of waste were sifted through, but Leo's remains were never found. This very fact left a gaping void in the story. The verdicts are delivered, the guilty are sentenced, but the boy's family never received the opportunity to bury his remains. This means that neither among the relatives nor in society did the feeling arise that justice was fully served. This story became an example of how a formally concluded criminal case continues to live on in people's memories. The house in Marcinelle, still standing empty. The social networks where comments are not deleted and where the name Isabel remains a symbol of betrayal, and the absence of the most important thing, confirmation that Leo has found his final resting place.